Today we're going to go over just basic steps on how to remove an engine from just about any vehicle that is rear-wheel drive, where the engine transmission is going to run down the length of the body instead of a front-wheel drive where it's running side to side. So the reason why we're doing that with this truck is because we bought this truck. We got it for a really good deal. However, we bought it with a bad engine. Real quickly, these are going to be general steps on how to take an engine out of a rear-wheel drive car, in this case specifically a truck, and you can apply these steps just about any truck or rear-wheel drive application. So the first thing to note is if it's a modern engine or anything really past the carburetor time, there's going to be a lot of electronics on it. We're talking fuel injectors, we're talking all your starter cables, we're talking sensors for your MAP sensors, coolant sensors, a bunch of sensors. They can get really confusing really quickly. So the biggest thing that I do, the first thing that I do, I start removing whatever components I can from the front of the engine. This will be like your alternator, power steering pump, AC pump, pulleys, everything you can get to that'll be easy to remove. And then every time I remove something, such as an electronical connection, I make sure I label it. So driver front injector. There's so many sensors on these things that if I don't know exactly what they are, I'll at least put where they came from. So on this one, I don't know exactly what it was, but it was on the head, and it was the passenger side, what I think is the ground. So that came over there. I'm pretty sure that one connected to right there. Sorry, right there. So you need to go through just a quick list of things that I can think of that need to be removed. Things like your oil pressure sender, your injectors. In this case, this is the GM. The injectors are really easy on this because it's one master plug that goes into the whole coil pack. The whole coil pack comes off as an assembly, which is super nice. You're going to have something like an engine ground. You're going to have MAP sensors. In this case, my MAP sensor is an aftermarket air filter, so it was easy to just leave that in place. Anything that can be removed should be removed and should be labeled. In some circumstances, some trucks, some vehicles, you have a master disconnect, such as like a giant plug, something like this. You can disconnect that and the entire engine harness will stay with the engine, and that's the best way to do it. Then you don't have to remove anything. You can transfer everything while it's outside. But in my case, it just didn't work. So yeah, step one would be remove everything you can from the outside, from the front of it, all of your accessories, including your fans. And then step two would be disconnect all your electrical and label it. I like to remove the intake manifold. In this engine, it's a plastic intake manifold, really easy to get off. The reason why I like to do that is, one, it's plastic, and this chain is going to be used to lift the engine out, and I don't want that chain going over a plastic piece and possibly breaking it. The other reason why I like to remove it is because there in the back, it gives me really good access to the bell housing bolts on the transmission. There's 3 of them up near the top on this engine, and it's much easier to access it from that side than trying to do it from the underneath. Another thing you'll have to disconnect, that right there is your fuel line. You need typically a special tool to get that off, such as a fuel disconnect tool. You can buy these for really inexpensive, or you can rent them, I believe, from your auto parts store for free. So you need to get one of those. You also have to figure out how you're going to put a chain on the engine. And most GMs, and I believe Fords are the same, you're going to have a threaded insert onto the head. So you just have to find out what bolt size that is, and then find a bolt that'll fit, and then also fit through a chain without slipping off. Make sure you get a chain that's going to be strong enough, and then you just go diagonal. So in this case, I have my bolt there, and I have a bolt on the back passenger side head as well, and the two should be plenty for that. Alternatively, you could also use these valley bolts, but I'm not a big fan of using that, although some people online say they use it without any problem. But in this case, I'm using this. If I didn't have the heads on, then I would probably use the valley bolts. You also need to take off the motor mounts, and those are them right there. In this case, I have 6 bolts, 3 on each side, that need to come off. So you can see one of them has been removed, that one in the middle is in there, then the one on the other side is also removed that you can't see. I leave 2 of them in place, one on each side, until I'm actually ready to start lifting. And I also leave 2 of the bell housing bolts in place as well. Reason being is most of the time your transmission is supported by your engine, so your transmission is going to have a rear mount on it. If we're looking at the underside of our engine transmission now, there's our engine. You can see the oil filter, and that pan right there is the transmission. If you look back, there's a nice support for the tail end of that transmission. But if you look at the front of the transmission is actually supported by the back of the engine. So if we were to take that engine out, that transmission is going to flop down. So we need to find a way to support it. This can be something as simple as just putting a bottle jack with maybe a 2x4 between the bottle jack and the transmission pan, and holding that in place. You could also do something like taking a strap and putting it between your frame rails. Just anything you can do to make sure that transmission just doesn't flop down. So once you have your transmission bell housing bolts removed, you're also going to have to disconnect the torque converter from the flywheel on the engine. I'm going to put a picture up here to kind of show you what I'm talking about. It's basically 3 bolts on this engine that connect the flywheel to the torque converter. If you remove the starter, and if you're at the front of the engine looking back towards the rear of the truck, that's how you're going to take those bolts off. There's 3 of them, and then what you'll do is you'll take your bolt on your crank here, and you're going to rotate this until you can get access to all 3 of those bolts. You're also going to need a way to lift the engine out. So an engine cherry picker will work just fine. In my case, I'm using more of a gantry kind of bridge setup. Make sure you have a strong hoist that's rated for the weight of your engine at least. Don't forget to disconnect your exhaust. You can do this either through the exhaust manifold bolts, or you can do it through the down tube or the down pipe where it actually connects in. Make sure you start spraying them several days beforehand with some kind of a penetrating oil, like a liquid wrench or a PB blaster. Any bolt you take off, make sure you label it very well. What I do is when I take a bolt off, I put it right back to where it was. And if that's not an option, then I'll put it in a plastic baggie and then label where that bolt came off of. Drain all your fluids, so the oil as well as your coolant, because you will have to disconnect your radiator. And then the last tip I'll have for you is when you're pulling this, make sure you go nice and slow. Make sure you have several people to help you, because as you're pulling this, if you're using a cherry picker or a gantry with a hoist, you're not going to notice if you have an electrical connection that's bound up, because the mechanical advantage you get with a cherry picker, you could be stuck on a wiring harness and start cranking on the cherry picker, and it's going to rip that electrical connection right off without noticing it. So make sure you have people on both sides. Never put yourself in a position where you're going to be directly underneath the engine, and just stay safe. So that's all I have for you. Thanks for watching.